What could make a Viking warrior, a man who laughed in the face of death, break down and weep? The answer isn't a lost battle or a mortal wound. It was the marriage ceremony itself. In Norse society, wedding vows weren't just promises. They were blood contracts that could destroy entire families. Tonight, we journey into the most brutal matrimonial system in human history, where love was a luxury and survival was the only currency that mattered. Picture this. It's 9th century Scandinavia. The northern winds howl across frozen fjords, and inside a massive longhouse, families gather not for celebration, but for negotiation. Marriage among the Vikings wasn't about romance. It was about survival, politics, and bloodlines. But before we dive into the horrifying details, let me paint you a picture of what marriage meant in a world where your wedding gift might be your husband's severed head. It began with the bride price, but this wasn't the gold and silver you might imagine. Thorkel Ironhand stared across the wooden table at Ragnar Bloodaxe, knowing that the negotiation for his daughter Astrid's hand would determine not just her fate, but the survival of his entire clan. 50 head of cattle, 20 thralls, and the head of my enemy, Bjorn the Black, Ragnar demanded. The bride price in Viking society was often paid in human lives. But that was just the beginning. Enter the practice of bridal running, a tradition so violent it made raids look civilized. Young Viking men would literally kidnap their chosen brides, sometimes from rival clans, sometimes from their own families, who refused the match. Astrid knew her fate was sealed when she heard the war horns at dawn. 20 armed men surrounded her father's longhouse, not to raid it, but to claim her as Ragnar's bride, whether she consented or not. The actual wedding ceremony began with blood, literally. Unlike Christian marriages that sealed unions with rings, Vikings sealed theirs with wounds. The bride and groom would slash their palms with consecrated knives, letting their blood drip onto the sacred hammer of Thor. By blood we bind, by blood we break, Astrid whispered the ancient words as her hand trembled, knowing that this ritual would tie her fate to Ragnar's for life or death. Then came the sword exchange, a ritual that revealed the true nature of Viking marriage. The groom would present his family sword to his bride, symbolically making her the guardian of his lineage. But here's the twist that made warriors weep. She could use that same sword to kill him if he failed to protect or provide for her. Marriage wasn't just a union, it was a potential death sentence with a blade hanging over both their heads. The wedding night itself was a trial by ordeal. In some clans, the marriage wasn't considered valid until the couple survived a night alone together, in the wilderness, armed only with basic weapons and tools. This survival marriage tested whether they could work together to stay alive, because if they couldn't survive one night together, how could they survive the harsh realities of Viking life? But the brutality didn't end with the ceremony. Viking wives faced a horrifying pressure: produce a male heir within the first year, or risk being cast aside, or worse. Astrid clutched her swollen belly 8 months into her marriage, knowing that if she bore a daughter, or if the child was born weak, Ragnar's family might invoke the ancient rite of barren bride punishment, which could involve anything from exile to ritual sacrifice. The punishment system for failed wives was more brutal than any battlefield execution. Archaeological evidence from burial sites across Scandinavia reveals the horrifying truth. Women buried alive with their hands bound. Women found in bogs with evidence of ritual strangulation. Women entombed in ships with their deceased husbands, whether they were dead or not. Marriage failure meant death failure. For those wives who survived the initial trials, another horror awaited: the multiple wives system. Wealthy Viking men could take as many wives as they could afford to maintain, but this created a hierarchy of brutality within the household. The first wife held power over subsequent wives, often treating them as slaves rather than sisters. Imagine sharing your husband not just with other women, but with women you were expected to command in battle, if necessary. Perhaps most shocking was the practice of seasonal wives, temporary marriages that lasted only through the harsh winter months. When spring came, these winter wives could be abandoned with no warning, no support, and often with children to raise alone in a society that showed no mercy to single mothers. These women faced a choice: find another temporary husband quickly or face starvation and social exile. Divorce among Vikings was possible, but it required trial by combat, not between the spouses, but between their families. If a woman wanted to divorce her husband, her male relatives had to literally fight his male relatives to the death. The losing family lost not just the fight, but often their property, status, and sometimes their lives. Astrid's brother Eric knew that challenging Ragnar's treatment of his sister meant potentially signing his own death warrant. Archaeological evidence reveals one of the most disturbing aspects of Viking marriage: child brides. Girls as young as 12 were married to grown men, not out of perversion, but out of practical necessity. In a society where life expectancy rarely exceeded 40, childhood was a luxury no one could afford. These child wives faced adult responsibilities, including childbearing, household management, and even warfare training. The maternal mortality rate among Viking women was catastrophic. Nearly 60% of women died in childbirth or from related complications. But here's the horrifying twist: a woman who died in childbirth was often buried with her baby still inside her womb, based on the belief that they needed to journey to the afterlife together. Pregnancy wasn't just dangerous, it was often a death sentence disguised as a blessing. Surviving your husband brought its own horrors. Viking widows faced a brutal choice: marry your deceased husband's brother or male relative, become a thrall, slave to the family, or face exile in the wilderness. The practice of widow inheritance meant that women were literally passed around like property. Some widows chose suicide rather than face this degradation, and their deaths were often celebrated as honourable choices. The concept of honour in Viking marriage was twisted beyond recognition. If a wife was suspected of infidelity, even without proof, her husband could legally kill her and any man she was suspected of associating with. But if he chose not to kill her, he lost his honour and could be challenged to combat by any man in the community. Marriage created a system where mercy was punished and brutality was rewarded. The fertility rituals preceding marriage were exercises in humiliation and pain. Young brides underwent purification ceremonies that involved ritual scarification, painful body modifications, and public examinations of their virginity. These weren't gentle traditions, but brutal ordeals designed to break the spirit and ensure complete submission to their future husbands and his family. Marriage transformed Viking women into economic units rather than human beings. A wife's value was calculated in terms of her ability to produce children, manage household production, and contribute to the family's wealth through textile work and food preparation. Account books from the period list wives alongside livestock and tools, property to be managed rather than people to be loved. Viking wives weren't just expected to manage households, they were expected to fight alongside their husbands in battle. This might sound empowering, but the reality was horrifying. Pregnant women, elderly wives, and mothers with infants were still expected to take up weapons when the family was threatened. Battle was not optional, it was another marital duty that could cost them their lives. Perhaps most shocking was the religious obligation for wives to potentially sacrifice themselves for their husband's spiritual well-being. If a prominent Viking man died, his wives might be expected to voluntarily join him in death through ritual sacrifice, believing they would serve him in Valhalla. Archaeological evidence shows that many women found in ship burials died violent deaths, suggesting these voluntary sacrifices weren't always voluntary. The psychological pressure on Viking wives was relentless. They lived under constant threat of abandonment, violence, or death, while simultaneously being expected to appear strong and capable. This created a generation of women who developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe trauma responses. But in Viking society, these responses were seen as character flaws rather than survival mechanisms. Marriage disputes didn't just affect couples, they could trigger clan warfare that lasted generations. A broken marriage agreement or perceived slight could lead to blood feuds that killed hundreds of people over decades. When Astrid's marriage to Ragnar failed to produce a male heir, it sparked a conflict between their clans that lasted 40 years and claimed over 300 lives across 3 generations. Viking. Marriage laws literally transferred ownership of women from fathers to husbands. Women couldn't own property, couldn't make legal decisions, and couldn't even speak in court without male representation. Marriage wasn't a partnership. It was a transfer of ownership disguised as a ceremony. The ring exchange symbolized not eternal love, but the passing of property rights from one man to another. As Viking wives aged and their fertility declined, they faced another horror: disposal. Elderly wives, who could no longer bear children or contribute significant labour, were often abandoned in the wilderness during harsh winters, a practice euphemistically called going to the woods. These women faced freezing temperatures and starvation, essentially being sentenced to death for the crime of aging. Viking beauty standards required extreme physical modifications that bordered on torture. Women plucked all their eyebrows, bleached their hair with harsh chemicals that often caused permanent scalp damage, and used toxic substances to achieve pale skin that often led to poisoning. The pursuit of beauty wasn't vanity, it was survival, as unattractive wives could be cast aside or killed for failing to maintain their husband's status. In households with multiple wives, competition for the husband's favour could turn deadly. Some Viking men would literally pit their wives against each other in combat, with the winner gaining preferential treatment and the loser facing punishment or death. These weren't playful competitions. They were fights to the death, using real weapons, with children watching their mothers potentially kill each other for scraps of affection. Viking women faced monthly exile during menstruation, banished to isolated huts outside the settlement for a week each month. During these exiles, they were forbidden from touching food, weapons, or other people. In winter, this exile was often a death sentence, as the huts provided minimal protection from the elements. Many women died alone in these menstrual huts, victims of a system that treated their natural biology as a curse. Viking mothers faced horrifying decisions about infant survival. In a society with limited resources, parents had to choose which children would receive food and care. Weak infants, twins, considered unlucky, or children born during famines were often abandoned in the wilderness, a practice called exposure. Mothers were expected to make these life and death decisions without showing emotion, as grief was considered weakness. The most disturbing aspect of Viking marriage was the slave wife system. Captured women from raids were forced into marriage with their captors, but their children held different legal status depending on whether their mothers were free or enslaved. These slave wives lived in constant fear, knowing that their husband's death could mean being passed to his relatives or sold to other Vikings as property. We're halfway through this horrifying journey, and you're probably wondering, how did women survive in this system? The answer is both inspiring and heartbreaking. Viking women developed underground networks of support, secret societies of knowledge sharing, and subtle forms of resistance that helped them navigate this brutal matrimonial landscape. But their survival came at costs that would break most modern people. Viking women created elaborate secret communication systems to warn each other about dangerous men, share survival strategies, and provide aid. During crises, they developed coded language, hidden signals, and underground support networks that operated beneath the surface of their oppressive society. These networks saved lives, but participation meant risking torture and death if discovered by male authorities. Perhaps most shockingly, Viking women became experts in poisons, both to protect themselves and to eliminate threats. They passed down knowledge of deadly plants, toxic minerals, and chemical combinations through generations of mothers and daughters. Many Viking men who died of mysterious illnesses were likely victims of wives who chose poison over enduring further abuse. Viking women fought back through spiritual means, becoming vulvas, seers, and practitioners of cedar magic. These roles gave them the only socially acceptable form of power, the ability to predict the future and communicate with gods. Many women used these positions to protect other women, curse abusive husbands, and maintain some degree of autonomy in an otherwise powerless existence. Viking wives learned to use economic sabotage as a weapon. They would deliberately spoil food, damage clothing, or waste resources to punish abusive husbands. Some became so skilled at these subtle forms of resistance that they could make their husbands' lives miserable while appearing to be dutiful wives. This economic warfare was dangerous but often effective in curbing the worst abuses. Viking mothers developed elaborate schemes to protect their children from the brutal realities of their society. They would hide food for daughters, secretly teach them survival skills, and sometimes even fake their children's deaths to remove them from dangerous situations. Some mothers sent their children away with traders or relatives, sacrificing their own happiness to ensure their children's survival. Survival required alliances, and Viking women became masters of building strategic relationships with other women, sympathetic men, and even rival clans. They would arrange marriages for their children, share resources, and create mutual protection agreements. These alliances often provided the only safety net available in a society that offered women no legal protections. The most desperate Viking women planned elaborate escapes from their marriages and communities. They would spend years accumulating resources, identifying safe havens, and preparing for dangerous journeys to distant lands. Some joined merchant caravans, others fled to Christian monasteries that offered sanctuary, and a few managed to establish new identities in foreign territories. Despite their legal disadvantages, some Viking women became experts at exploiting loopholes in Norse law. They learned to use religious obligations, clan loyalties, and traditional customs to protect themselves and other women. These legal experts became valuable resources for the underground female networks, providing knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. Viking women monopolized medical knowledge, becoming the primary healers and midwives in their communities. This gave them access to powerful tools, including knowledge of contraceptives, abortion techniques, and treatments for injuries sustained from domestic violence. Medical expertise became both a form of power and a survival mechanism in their brutal society. Despite their oppression, Viking women maintained and transmitted their culture through storytelling, textile arts, and religious practices. They preserved the knowledge that would later become the Norse sagas, maintained family histories, and kept alive the traditions that defined their identity. This cultural work gave their lives meaning beyond mere survival. Modern archaeology is revealing the true extent of Viking women's suffering and resistance. Skeletal remains show evidence of domestic violence, nutritional deficiencies, and stress-related diseases. But they also reveal evidence of women who fought back, weapons in female graves, signs of healing from combat wounds, and burial goods that suggest some women achieved positions of power despite the system's brutality. DNA analysis of modern Scandinavian populations reveals the lasting impact of Viking marriage practices. The genetic evidence shows patterns of forced migration, population bottlenecks, and lineage disruptions that reflect the violent and coercive nature of Viking matrimonial systems. The very genetics of modern Scandinavians tells the story of their female ancestors' suffering. While Vikings are often portrayed as uniquely brutal, their marriage practices were actually common throughout medieval Europe. They were just more honest about the violence. The difference was that Viking society didn't hide behind religious justifications or romantic ideals. They acknowledged that marriage was a business transaction with potentially deadly consequences for women. The conversion to Christianity didn't initially improve conditions for Viking women. In some ways, it made them worse. Christian marriage laws removed some of the few protections Norse customs had provided, such as the right to divorce and remarry. The new religion brought different forms of oppression, replacing pagan brutality with Christian constraints on women's behavior and choices. As Viking society transitioned from raiding to trading, marriage practices evolved but remained brutal. Women became valuable as connections to trading networks rather than just as bearers of warriors. This shift changed the nature of their oppression, but didn't eliminate it. They were still property, just valued for different reasons. Modern popular culture has romanticized Viking marriage, turning brutal reality into fantasy adventure. Movies, books, and TV shows portray Viking women as empowered shield maidens, ignoring the horrific reality most actually faced. This romanticization dishonors the memory of women who suffered and died in a system designed to destroy them. The few surviving accounts written by Viking women themselves, found in runes, textile patterns, and coded messages, tell stories of unimaginable suffering, but also incredible resilience. These testimonies, hidden in plain sight for centuries, are only now being properly decoded and understood by scholars who recognize their true significance. Analysis of Viking burial practices and artifact distributions reveals patterns consistent with widespread psychological trauma among women. The way women were buried, the objects included with them, and the positions of their remains all suggest a population suffering from what we would now recognize as severe PTSD and learned helplessness. Perhaps most tragically, the trauma of Viking marriage created cycles that passed from mothers to daughters across generations. Women who survived the system often became enforcers of it, treating younger women harshly because they had learned that kindness was weakness. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of abuse that lasted for centuries. Despite the system's brutality, the resistance networks created by Viking women laid groundwork for later women's rights movements in Scandinavia. The survival strategies they developed, the alliances they built, and the knowledge they preserved contributed to the eventual transformation of Scandinavian society into one of the world's most gender-equal regions. The story of Viking marriage offers crucial lessons for understanding how oppressive systems function and how they can be resisted. The strategies Viking women used to survive, building networks, preserving knowledge, protecting children, and maintaining hope, remain relevant for understanding human resilience under extreme conditions. New archaeological discoveries continue to reveal previously unknown aspects of Viking marriage practices. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of women's burial practices that suggest some achieved significant power despite the system's constraints. Each new find adds complexity to our understanding of how these women navigated their brutal world. Cutting-edge research suggests that the trauma experienced by Viking women may have left epigenetic marks that were passed down through generations. The brutal marriage system may have literally changed the genetic expression of stress responses in ways that affected their descendants for hundreds of years, trauma written into the very DNA of survival. Elements of Viking marriage trauma persist in Scandinavian cultural memory, reflected in folk tales, traditional songs, and family customs that outsiders might not recognize as references to historical suffering. These cultural memories serve as both warnings and tributes to the women who endured unimaginable hardships. The Viking marriage system wasn't unique in its brutality, but it was unusually honest about its violence. Comparing it to contemporary marriage practices worldwide reveals that the fundamental problem, treating women as property rather than people, was nearly universal in medieval societies. The Vikings were just more open about the costs. The evolution from brutal Viking marriage to modern Scandinavian gender equality didn't happen overnight. It took nearly 1,000 years of gradual change, resistance, and social evolution. Understanding this timeline helps us appreciate both how far society has come and how fragile these advances remain. As we near the end of this difficult journey through history, it's important to remember that every brutal practice we've discussed was experienced by real women with real names, real dreams, and real suffering. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics or historical curiosities, but as human beings who endured the unendurable and found ways to survive and resist. While we like to think such brutal marriage practices are ancient history, elements of these systems persist in various forms around the world today. Understanding the Viking experience helps us recognize and resist contemporary forms of marriage-based oppression, ensuring that the lessons learned from their suffering contribute to protecting women today. The real story of Viking marriage isn't just about brutality, it's about the incredible strength, intelligence, and resilience of women who faced impossible odds and found ways to survive, protect their children, and maintain their humanity. These women were not victims. They were warriors fighting a different kind of battle, using weapons of wit, wisdom, and unbreakable will. What could make a Viking warrior weep? Now you know. It wasn't the fear of death in battle, it was the recognition that the women in their society endured suffering that made warfare look like mercy. The next time you hear about traditional marriage values, remember Astrid. Remember the women who bled for contracts they never chose. And remember that progress is not inevitable. It must be fought for, generation after generation. Their story reminds us that behind every golden age in history, someone was paying the price in blood and tears. We honour them by ensuring their suffering was not in vain.